The U.S. still leads the world in both coronavirus cases and deaths, but some other countries that seem to flatten their curves are now seeing a rebound in infections. NBC News global correspondent Bill Neely joins me now. Bill, where are these coronavirus rebounds happening?
Yes, hi, Alison. Well, from Manila in the Philippines to Manchester here in England, from Melbourne in Australia to Madrid in Spain, the story really is the same. New lockdown measures as a result of rising numbers of cases and infections. Perhaps the most startling is in the Philippines, where the capital city, Manila, has new lockdown restrictions on 12 million people for at least the next 2 weeks. It had relaxed those restrictions, partly for economic reasons. Now they're back on. A similar story in Melbourne, the second city of Australia, where 5 million people now face a nighttime curfew, and 1 million workers there will not be able to go to factories or shops for the next few weeks. Now, those are as a result of rising numbers. In Mexico, it's a situation of rampant numbers. So Mexico overtook the United Kingdom a few days ago as the country with the third biggest death toll in the world. Nearly 50,000 deaths. Of course, the United States way out ahead in the numbers of deaths. Brazil second, Mexico now third, partly because its president, President Obrador, rather like President Bolsonaro of Brazil and President Trump, is a COVID skeptic. He doesn't like, he won't wear a mask. He doesn't like lockdowns. He doesn't believe in social distancing. And Mexico has suffered, not just as a result of that, but as a result of poor testing and many, many other things. So, Alison, the story around the world really is of these rising rates, partly in Europe, because the tourist season is in full flow now and people are travelling as never before.
Bill, is that one of the major causes? Because some of these countries we're talking about were quicker to enact coronavirus restrictions in the U.S. So we're wondering a bit here, like, why are they seeing a resurgence? Travel a big contributor?
Yeah, undoubtedly travel is a contributor. The World Health Organization also puts it down to fatigue, to countries that had locked down early, which thought they were past the worst, and then they get hit again. South Africa, for example, being a very good example of that. And here in Manchester, in England, the chief public health official had a startling phrase for it, Alison. She said that the outbreak in Manchester was a warning to a complacent white middle class in the city, because black British people in the north of England and Asian people had been hit very badly by the virus. She explained it as white people just thinking, oh, well, you know, we're fine. We can go to pubs, we can go to restaurants because it's past. It's not going to hit us. And she had a warning that that simply is not the case.
Yeah. Bill, let's talk about the race for a vaccine. Which countries are showing the most progress, the most promise on that front?
Yeah, there's almost a bit of vaccine nationalism, if you like, Alison. And Russia has now claimed that it is way ahead of its rivals. It says it's going to start producing a vaccine next month and will begin mass immunization in October. But people are very, very skeptical because people think that these trials and the testing was just rushed through. For example, the researchers sometimes dosed themselves. Now, there's huge dangers to that, not just of the possibility of side effects, but of the possibility that the vaccine just won't work at all. The World Health Organization is tracking about 140 attempts across the world, the most promising being one in the US, one in the UK, and one in China. But the World Health Organization also had a warning saying there is no silver bullet at the minute, and there probably never will be. So I think we just have to, you know, great hopes. We all want there to be a vaccine, but I think the World Health Organization warning is well warned, is an adequate one and a wise one.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, thank you so much for catching us up on what's going on around the world. Appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.